Actions. What are actions? These aren't just any actions, server actions. Well, they're somewhat self-explanatory. Actions are basically functions that will run on your server, and you explicitly tell React this using a decorator that this is where you're going to write code that interacts with your API and makes backend changes like database updates. Best used with forms when updating data. Use action state is a hook that makes this even more convenient. Quick rundown on how you use them. You first have to define the decorator, use server at the top of the file, and to use this in your client-side component, you simply pass it down as a prop, or you import the action directly. When using it as a form action with use action state, the form action will be passed two parameters. It will be passed to previous state, and then the form data is arguments. This makes it really simple to grab any data from your form. You might have 10 inputs or even more, and you don't have to set up state for any of those. Use action state will manage all of that for you. Just to show you how effective this is for making backend changes, we're going to set up an AWS SDK project that will create a DynamoDB table for us, AWS's NoSQL database, and we're going to send that data through our front-end React form using a server action to upsert that data to our database. Let's get into it. Let's get started by creating a new project, npx create React app, and we're going to call it React 19 Server Actions -yt template TypeScript. Yeah, that's finished. So I just opened up the repo. As you can see here, we've got a blank canvas. First thing we're going to do, open up the package.json. React 19 isn't released yet, so we're going to install the exact versions, yarn add exact React and React DOM@rc. Brilliant. And we're going to update the types as well, so they're using the correct version. The npm types -react DOM, and then something similar here. npm types react, just react@rc. Then I'm going to go down to our overrides. We're going to create overrides because there isn't any yet overrides, and the @types -react. Let's see if I can remember. Yeah, that's got to be the same thing we put up there. So npm types -react@rc, types -react DOM, npm types -react DOM@rc. And now that's done, we'll do a yarn. Right, that's finished, and we're just going to do a start to make sure everything is working. Right, let's take a look. Let's open up Chrome. Oh, yeah, there we go. Can confirm it is working. Don't know why my webcam's down there. Let's put me back up in the top corner where I belong. I've just stopped the dev server, so we're going to get into something interesting. First of all, we're going to check if we've got the called AWS CDK installed. So do npmi global for AWS CDK. Let's confirm if that's set up correctly. So I'm going to make a new directory in here for backend. Keep it separate from our front end code. And yeah, I don't want to cd into that backend. And let's try CDK init app -- language TypeScript. Right, that is finito. All done. And there are two files I really care about here. I'm just going to close the console down, give us a bit more room. So in backend-lib now, there's this backend stack. And this is basically where we define our AWS services that we want to use. So as you can see, I've got like SQS as an example. We're going to use DynamoDB in here, but we'll get onto that later. So there's one more file I want to bring your attention to, which is in the bin directory, backend.ts. And this is where our CDK application code is going to go. Now, before we carry on with the code, there are a few things that you will need to have set up if you want to follow along. You will first have to download the AWS CLI. I'll put a link to that or a command to that over the screen. And then you will have to go to the AWS Management Console. You'd have to set up an account there. And then once you have those, your account set up, you should create a IAM user with relevant permissions, and then create a CLI access key for that IAM user. Make a note of your secret key because you will need that. And then finally, you want to run AWS configure in your terminal and put in your AWS access ID and secret key when prompted, and set up a default region as well. You can either go for a geographical location that's close to you, or what I do is I use US East 1 because they get most services, because it's sort of like the original AWS region. Now that we've got all that set up, we're going to create a .env file, and we're going to instantly add that to our git ignore because we don't want anyone peeking inside our env file. So if you commit this up, no one's getting your secrets. It's very secure. What we're going to put in here for the CDK is the AWS account ID and the AWS region. And where you get the AWS account ID from, go onto the management console, click this up here, and you can copy it right to your clipboard. And so once you have those two, pop them in this .env. I'm not actually going to show my secrets, so that'll be a bad idea. And then you're going to want to go ahead to go back to this backend.ts file, and we want to set up .env. So if we do .env, should import it first. Import as .env from .env, and then do .env.config. Okay, and then we should have access to those environment variables. And then we can use the type environment from the AWS SDK lib. And that's going to equal account. We can use our AWS account now. It's going to be process.env.aws account ID. And then we want our region. It's going to be process.env.aws region ID. AWS. Didn't realize this existed. I can cloak it. Okay, so I can show my .env file and not get into too much trouble. And then finally, we want to pass that down to our stack. So we're going to set env to this environment variable we created up here. And this one is optional, but when I was just sort of testing this stuff out, my stack got into a funny state where it wouldn't let me delete it because of a Route 53 hosted zone that didn't exist. It was weird, but I got around it eventually. But if I had termination protection set to false, that would have made things a lot easier. So just with this demonstration, because this isn't a production project, I'm just going to set termination protection to false to make things easier if things get into a funny state. Let's get into the backend stack. So first thing we want to do, we want to import DynamoDB, the CDK, not CDK, sorry, import everything DynamoDB from, and that's going to be from the CDK lib dash AWS DynamoDB. That's the one. Now we want to create a new DynamoDB table. How do we do that? So let's create a new variable called notes table. There's going to be a table that stores notes, and that's going to be a new DynamoDB dot table. That's going to take in this, and then the name, which is going to be notes table. I'm going to put YT onto the end of it just so I know what table it is in my AWS account. Partition key. So this is basically the primary key if you're from a more sort of SQL-y background. And what's the name of that? That's going to be ID. Okay, and then you also have to say the type as it is strictly typed. So that's going to be a DynamoDB attribute type. That's going to be a string. And my spell check is just telling me I've spelled Dynamo a very weird way here. So selected that and I've hit Control D, Control D. That's better. There's a couple more optional things I'm going to set up here with our table. So the first one of which is going to be the billing mode. As you can either have this to be provisioned, or you can have it to be pay per request. Because this isn't going to get a lot of use, it's just some sort of dev thing that we're playing around with, right? We're going to set that to pay per request because we don't have to provision a certain amount of usage because we know it's not going to get a whole lot of usage. And then there's also going to be the removal policy, which in our case, I want this to be removal policy destroy, which means that when we destroy our CDK stack, this table comes down as a part of that, because it just makes it easier to clean up the resources in our AWS account. I don't think we actually need this as a constant, so I'm just going to delete that, and I think that is all we need to do to create our DynamoDB table. I'll open up that console, let's do a CDK. I think first if we do an npm run build actually, but not in this directory. We want to get into the backend. That is where our our package JSON and all that lives here. Okay, so do an npm run build. That's finished building. You can then do a CDK synth, which is going to describe in detail what changes are actually going to be made to our environment. As you can see here, it's basically just listing off what's going to happen. So we're going to build a table. It's going to have the properties that we set up. It's going to create an ID with a string, a billing mode is pay per request, and deletion policy, and then it's got a whole bunch of metadata here, and that's all the regions that the metadata is available for. So I don't see anything worrying here. I'm going to go ahead and run a CDK deploy to deploy this to the back end. And there you have it, that's finished deploying. Let's open up the console and see if we can see our new DynamoDB table in there. I've gone on here to the DynamoDB service page, that's how you call it. And you can see backend stack dash notes table. It's a bit of a horrible name, but that is our DynamoDB table right there. And we'll explore items. There isn't any items in there. But what I am going to do, I'm going to take a note of this name. I'm going to copy that, because we'll be needing that later. And in fact, why don't we just go straight into here. I'm going to open up the end file. Ooh, still got those masks out. You're not seeing my secrets. I'm going to just create a new one, quits table. Okay. Let's not cloak that out yet, so you could all see my table. Uh-oh. Anyway, that is all we need to do in the back end for this project. So thank you for bearing with me for that. I know if you haven't used AWS before, that might have been a bit of a nightmare to look at, but it's over with. Don't worry, we got through it together. So I'm just going to close all of that down. I'm going to clear the console. I'm going to, wow, I'm in caps lock. It's so angry. I'm going to do a yarn start. I'm going to restart the development server. And let's open up the app.tsx. I'm just going to rip out all this stuff. Don't actually need it. I'm going to create another header called, what should we call this? It's going to be the actions. In action. Yeah, why not? Yeah, we're going to go ahead and I'm just going to close that folder down so we don't actually need it open. Or collapse it, I should say. I'm not deleting it or anything. I'm going to create a components folder, and I'm just going to create a actions.ts file. This is where we'll actually have our server actions, and I'm going to put the use server directive there to tell React that this is a server action. This is something that's going to run on our server side. In components, we're going to go ahead and create a component, funnily enough, called create note.tsx. We'll hit RFC, got that snippet, it's done a bunch of code for us already, love it. And what is this going to take in? So we're going to use action state for this, because use action state makes working with actions a lot easier. And then I'm also going to create some default state here. So initial note state, which is going to have a content, which is going to be null to start with. Spelled content wrong. Content, there we go. Oh, hang on, that's not right. It shouldn't be a semicolon there. And we're going to create a type file as well. We are using TypeScript, so types.tsx. I'm going to create a export interface. We're going to create an interface for our notes here. So it's going to be for our note state, and content is going to be of type string, or it can be null as well, like when we don't actually have any notes yet. So it's going to have an error, because if an error comes back from our server action, if anything happens on AWS's end when creating this request to our DynamoDB table, we then want to display this error to the front end. So we're going to store that here in this object. Let's carry on getting the front end hooked up. I'm going to go back to create note, and this is actually going to be a form. We're not going to worry about the functionality just yet. We'll get some front end code showing up so we can see what we're playing with. And that's going to have a name, and that's important because this is actually going to be the property name when we submit the form. That's going to be what we want to extract. I'll show you how to do that later. There's going to be a type, text. I don't really need an ID in this. Why not? We'll add an ID as well. ID of note. Button. There's going to have a type of submit. So that will submit our form action. And it's just going to say add note. And then to see this in action, we're going to have to go to our app.tsx, which we have open here. And let's import our component, create note. That isn't taking any props or anything. That's not looking good. We've got an issue. Let's carry on working through our action itself. So it looks like it's not happy with that because it's not exporting anything. So it's literally just a blank file at the moment, I suppose. So if I just do export, and it's going to be an async function. That's typed out for me, cool. This is going to take in 2 parameters actually, but I'm just going to do that for placeholder reasons. Let's just do, you know what, I'm going to mock out an asynchronous request. So we're going to do await new promise. Resolve as a param, and let's see here, we'll do a set timeout that will resolve our promise, and then we'll return I'm an action in action. Yes, you are. Let's go back to, that's not happy because a duplicate identifier. Yeah, of course that's not going to work. Silly me. Right, for now, it doesn't take in anything. Okay, is this going to be happy with us now? It's happy with us. So that's our basic front end. We have an input, we have a button that's type submit. That isn't actually going to do anything as of yet, but we'll work on getting that all hooked up now. Going back to our create note component, form is going to take an action, which is going to be, what do I call this? Name. I'm going to give us a better name. It's going to be submit notes, because that's what it's going to do. It's going to submit a note to our database eventually, but we're going to incrementally work on that. And we can just import that literally just import that function straight into our client-side component here. But you know what I'm doing? I'm just returning the string. I thought I was logging it out. So I'm going to log out now. Action running. And if I go back to Chrome, great. Yeah, there we go. We can see the actions running, and it took a wee bit of time because of that set timeout. So that's all working as well. That's an asynchronous request. Now let's go ahead and hook that all up, but this time using use action state. So we're going to start off by creating the action state. So that gives us a state form action, which is what we're going to pass to our form action, and also gives us a, I think it's pending, that's right, that is use action state, and we have to pass in our, it should tell us here, yep, initial state. So we get that initial note state, and then I think we need to give it our action as well, which is going to be submit note. That's our action here. Now, remember we made that type earlier. Well, we haven't actually hooked up that type with this bit of state. So let's go ahead and do that now. So the initial note is initial note state. Do you know what I've done wrong here? That should be the opposite way around. So let's swap them to about. So submit note, the action should be first, and then initial note state should be after that. Yeah, we're going to go ahead and pass down the form action to our forms action. Then just open up action here, and we're actually going to get the pref state, and that's going to be of type I note state. So let's import that, and then we also get the form data, which is of type form data. We just need to change what this is returning now. So that's not just going to return a string. If you remember our iNoteState type, it's actually going to return an object with content and then possibly an error as well. Oh, note. So if I just go back into create note, that needs a comma there now. I've swapped it around, but I've got to sort the comma out. Yay. And we're going to check if this is pending. If it is, we want to return, just imagine a really nice loading spinner here. We're just going to return a p with loading ... And down here, if state dot content is true, we want to then let's make another p that actually displays that content, and I'll do like a little note is, so what that is, and then once again, if state.error is a thing, we want to say, I'll make it a p again. Something went wrong. And then we can actually say what that error is. Right, let's sort out these red squigglies. So if we go back into action, and then if we do something like this, so we want to get the note out of form data. So I go const new note, because this note that would have just been submitted equals form data, and we can use the get method. And what was that name here? Note. So we're going to use the name of the input to grab that data, and that should be a string. If there is no new note, like if that's an empty string or anything, then we want to return error no note. Please include a note next time you submit, sir, madam. Don't know if it's bloke or woman, do we? And I think I also want to set content. Don't think that should ever be undefined. We'll set that to be null. And there we go. Okay, that's got no more red squiggly lines. It looks a lot nicer. Now going back into the action, we can log out. So we've got action running here. The new note submitted is, we can just log out to actually see if that is coming out correctly. And I just realised we can go one better than that. Instead of setting the content to this bit of rubbish, we can even set the content to be new note. Okay, so I think that should all work. Let's give it a whirl, shall we? So we'll open up Chrome, open up the DevTools, just clear all that. Great. Loading. Note is great. Sure is. That's a nice example using mock data on how we can use action state with an action, a server action here. However, it's not realistic. I mean, we are using this promise to sort of fake a bit of loading time. Shall we see how it would actually look in a real example interacting with our DynamoDB table? Yes, we shall. So first thing I'm going to do, I want to wrap our promise. I want to wrap our API request in a try catch, and if anything happens, I want to return error. Oh no, I want to return an object. I do want that, and I want content to be null, and I want error to be whatever error is. Yeah. But there are two packages that I want to install. Oh, ignore all that red, horrible looking stuff. There are two packages I want to install. Or should I say yarn add in our case. One of them is UUID, for creating a unique ID when we submit our note, because we have that ID, I think it's called a petition key in our DynamoDB table. I always think of it as a primary key, so sort of from a more MySQL background. And I also want to install the DynamoDB client. I'll just find the name of that package. That is, yeah, that's right. So it's the @AWS SDK -client DynamoDB. That's it. Oh, I don't need that, do I? Yeah, I can just add multiple packages without that. Okay, now those have finished installing. I'm going to close that down again so we can actually see what we're up to. I just want to update this error to be error when submitting notes to the DB. So that works. Okay, and then we want to import DynamoDB. We want to import the client. So what's that? DynamoDB client. I think we want that in these square braces here. And that's going to be from the AWS SDK, that one. And then we're also going to want to import the put command. So put item command. And for TypeScript's sake, we want to also import the put item command input type as well, or interface in this case. And then for our ID, there's one more input to do. We want v4 as UUID v4 from UUID. And just for reference, you can see this is how we use UUID. And this is that npm package sort of page, and use import v4 as UUID v4. And if we just run that method, we get this output as a lovely unique string that we can use as our ID. And likewise for DynamoDB, AWS SDK for JavaScript version 3 actually has quite a decent documentation page now compared to how it used to look. When we go down to DynamoDB, we are using put item. I'm just going to control F through them because there's an absolute ton of methods. Put item command, and this shows you how to use it. I'll put links for these in the description if you want to have a look through yourself and see what else you can add to the project, or if you need a bit of support getting these up and running. Now with that being said, there are actually a couple more .n variables. How does this work? How do I add another one? Oh, it's a bit weird with this cloaking. So if I add AWS We're going to call this access key ID and AWS access secret access key. Okay, so we're going to add those. The way you get these is you go to your IAM console on AWS, on their AWS console. Yeah, go to IAM, and you basically, for whatever users you've created, if you've created one that has permission to make DynamoDB changes, you will go on there and you will request a secret key that has permission to do things on the AWS CLI or SDK, and then you'll just paste the ID and the secret in here. Oh, and actually, to use these in a React application, we need to prepend them with React app underscore. So let's go ahead and add that to our secret access key. And finally, our AWS notes table name as well. We'll add React underscore app to that. So just for reference, I'm going to copy these. I'm holding down Alt as I double click to select multiple things at once. I'm going to go over to Actions, because this is where we're going to be using them. And just for reference, we're going to paste them in there because they're quite long names, so I can't be bothered to type them out manually. Right, with those keys in place now, we're going to set up the DynamoDB client, as this is what we will need to interact with DynamoDB. Don't use caps lock, we do const, and we're going to call this the DynamoDB client. And that is going to equal Dynamo. We're going to do new DynamoDB client, if I'm not mistaken. Yep, DynamoDB client, and that is going to take in a configuration object, which do I have to do? Oh yeah, credentials. We'll add the credentials, which is going to be our access key ID. We'll do process.env to access our environment variables. I'm just going to go ahead and copy that AWS access key ID. And we're also going to need ourselves, oh, and yeah, use that exclamation mark. Just means that it's always going to be defined, otherwise we'll get a TypeScript issue. We need our secret access key. Again, process.env dot, and just copy and paste that here. And with the exclamation mark, because we're just saying, yep, this is always going to be a thing, don't you worry. It's always going to exist in our .env file. And for the region as well, that's, I believe I'm not exposing that one. So back in our env file, if I just prepend react underscore app underscore, I'll grab that. And then that's going to be process. What is that? Process.env dot. Hey, looking good. Don't need these anymore. Gonna delete them. Gonna keep the reference to this env because we will need that, however. And we're going to create ourselves a DynamoDB put item input. We'll think of a better name for that for the variable. Let's call this the put item input. And that's going to have the type that we're importing up there. Put item command input. Okay, so what does this need? TypeScript will help us here, luckily. I think that needs a table name. Yes, it does. And this is why we copy and paste this. So I'm going to get that in the clipboard now. The table name. So it's process.env dot, and then paste that. Again, I'm going to do exclamation mark to tell it that it's always going to exist, so we don't get any TypeScript issues. And what else do we need? Item is the other property. Okay, so I know for a fact that we have an ID column, our petition key. What is that? So you have to open up these curly braces because it takes in an object, and then you have to say what type it is, which is S for string. And we are going to use the UUID v4 method here that we're importing from the UUID library. And that's going to generate us a unique key that we're going to use as the ID for our note object. DynamoDB, you don't predefine all of your columns. I believe they're called. It might be called something else in NoSQL. So you just create whatever column name you want, and that will just automatically add that to your table. So we want a note that's also going to be of type string. And what we're putting in here, we're putting in a new note. However, it might be undefined. So what I'll do is I'm going to cut that. I'm going to cut both of these things because there's no point creating the variable if a new note doesn't exist. Pop that in there. Okay, so that way we're checking if new note does actually exist before we create the DynamoDB client and we start creating this per item input. Now that I just realized I've had this sidebar open all the time, we're going to close exit. Now notice it's slightly distracting me. I'm going to go down to our try and we want to do I think we still need to create the what's it called, put item command. So this probably doesn't need to be in a try. I'm going to make it in a try anyway because then it will scope it properly. Yeah, I do want this in a try. So put item command, and I think that is going to be equal to a new put item command. It's this fella that we imported earlier, put item command from the client DynamoDB library. And what's that going to take in? That is going to take in none other than put item input. So we're going to want to store the response to insert data into the DynamoDB table request. So we're going to call that put item response, and that's going to equal to a new, no, not a new, it's going to await a client. So this is using our DynamoDB client, DynamoDB client, I should say. So it's going to await DynamoDB client dot send, and we're going to send this put item command that we have built here. And the reason why I'm storing this in the constant is so we can then check if the commands dot, well, no, not put item commands, or put item response. We can check if the response is metadata dots, and then we should have a HTTP status code is equals to 200. Or should I say we're going to check if it's not equals to 200. If that is the case, something's gone wrong. So we're going to return content to be null. I spelled content wrong. Content to be null. Still saying it's wrong, I'll just type it out again. And we're going to set the error to be issue with DB request, but item DB request. I'm going to be specific. Status code is not equal to 200. However, if we get past this, all is well. I'm just going to return content, can't spell today, and that's going to be new note. Then this code is no longer accessible as we're doing a whole bunch of returns further up, so we can delete that, delete that, delete that, just do a wee bit of tidying up, and that is all looking good. We're going to give it a test. Let me open up Chrome again. Let me make this full screen again, and then I'm going to refresh. Let's do new note in the DB, please. Please. There was an error. The DB region is missing. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to log out all of my environment variables to make sure they exist. Console.log, make a new object. I'm just going to paste all of these in there, make sure that they are properly returning. So I'm not going to make that an object because that won't work. Yeah, we'll just do that. Make sure all of these do exist. However, I don't want you guys seeing my secret, so I'm not going to show you the results of this login. I just want to show you my debugging process. Debugging session over. Can confirm those do all exist now. So after adding those to the env file, I just had to reboot the dev server. So if you run into the same issue, just stop your yarn start, do another yarn start, and that should all work. That being said, let's actually do a proper test. I'm going to open up Chrome again. I'm going to do proper note this time. Whoa, that was rapid. Okay, that's showing up here on the front end, so that's all working. I'm going to actually open up AWS now. Right, in the management console, make it full screen. Let's see, this is the amazing table. That has a very catchy name. Oh, oh, you look at that. Isn't that just the note we typed in on our React application and submitted using a server action? Yes, it is. It is the very one. And that is how easy it is to hook up to AWS. Now that we've finished with the coding with our project, I'm going to stop the dev server and going to CD back into our back end. I'm going to do a CDK destroy. And what that's going to do is just going to clean up our stack, and it's going to delete the resources that's deployed, which in our case is that DynamoDB database. A database table, I should say. I hope with that demonstration it just shows how easy it is to integrate React using server actions with your APIs and your backend infrastructure, like using services such as DynamoDB on AWS. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time. Goodbye.